Hello, and thank you for joining me for the second episode of what I've decided to call the Single Malt Review Casual Drams. Today's casual dram is even more casual than last time. It's not even a single malt. It's Chivas Regal 18-year-old blend. And that's blended Scotch Whisky, not blended malt whisky. There is a difference. Blended malt whisky is comprised of single malts together, whereas blended Scotch whisky is usually a really quite significant portion of grain whisky, which has not been pot distilled and does not come from a single malt distillery. It comes from one of a very few really rather large plants. So that's what we're dealing with here. Chivas Regal. It really comes in actually quite a good bottle. I'll give you a bit of a close-up there. I hope that's in shot. There's a lot of glassware involved here. It would be a pretty lethal weapon, but we shouldn't spend too much time on the packaging because it doesn't tell you a great deal about what's inside. What it does say is that it's 18 years old, so just like a single malt, that means the youngest component in there is going to be no less than 18 years old, and some portions of it, not a great deal, but some, will be significantly older than 18 years old to get the sort of thing they're looking for. At any rate, let's have a wee look at what's inside. The first thing, and one of the more surprising things, is there is peat in here, which there is manifestly not if you're familiar with its extremely close cousin, Chivas Regal 12-year-old, which I think almost every single person, whisky lover or not, must have encountered at least once. It's an extremely, you'd call it, inoffensive blend, and that's probably the best and worst you could say about it. I don't think it's very interesting. I think this is within a certain threshold of interesting. So, let's see. There is peat, and that's unusual. A great many blends are completely unpeated, so to see it in there is already a bit more interesting than usual. In addition to that, there is your usual Speyside characteristics of clear, light clover honey, quite a lot of nice white-fleshed fruits, and sort of gentle floral characters. But trying to attribute that to any one thing is really rather hard in blends because there is quite possibly upwards of 30 or even 40 single malts that go into here. Not to mention the grain whisky that gets tipped in as well, which usually accounts for more than 50% of the spirit content. So, trying to attribute individual distillery characteristics is completely fraught, so I won't do it. What this is a really quite mathematical balancing act that's been brought together by a man called the Master Blender, of which there is only a few of in the world because I hear it's a very difficult job. Which makes sense when you think this Chivas 18 needs to taste like last year's Chivas 18, which needs to taste like 5 years ago's Chivas 18, and the changeable nature of Scotch whisky vintages is such that that's really quite a difficult task. So, yeah, Master Blend is rare for a reason, I think. At any rate, let's see what's on the palate. It's understandably soft, because it's always going to be. You'd be hard-pressed to find a blended mass-market whisky that wasn't. They're always going to be a smooth drop, but this one is just about the interest level that I'm looking for in my whisky. The Glenfarclas, I wish. The Chivas 12-year-old is certainly not. That is fairly banal, if you ask me. This one is beginning to get a little bit of nuance to it. There are multiple things at work here, and the main thing that does it for me is that really fine balance with the peat. You'll never get that in a born peated whisky, a peated single malt. Those will always wear their peated qualities right on their sleeve, and even if they're less peated, it's always right there. It's always very obvious. Here, because they can put just a few drops in, it can be quite ethereal and quite I wouldn't want to give it, I wouldn't want to call it beguiling or anything too overblown, but it's pretty interesting. It can manifest in a more subtle way than a single malt ever will. And so that's something to say about it. Otherwise, it really is just a mix of quite nicely balanced soft Speyside characters, which is understandable given that the heart malt, which is the colloquial term given to the primary malt influence of which the other flavours are built around for most of the Chivas blends at least. I'm not sure about the Chivas Extra, their new one they've done, is Strath Isla, which is a pretty well-known Speyside whisky. They do a pretty available 12-year-old version, and once in a blue moon they'll show up in independent bottles, but it's really very uncommon. I've never tried an independently bottled one, but Strath Isla is a very, very archetypical Speyside whisky, so that this is built around it is it tastes as you'd imagine. But I think it's actually rather good. It's sort of equal parts peaty, soft, and juicy. It's like Speyside with that little bit of old-fashioned peat coming in. Maybe if I were to attribute it to a single malt, which is almost impossible, maybe a very, very fresh Cragganmore, or Strath Isla itself, although I'm not particularly well read on that particular distillery. What else to say? I think there's an analogy that many whisky commentators use when describing blends versus single malts, which is terribly overused, but I think it's very apt. They describe them as, musically speaking, single malts are one individual movement. A lovely honeyed Speyside might be an aria, there might be a drum solo, one might be like Michael Flatterly flying around the stage, who knows. They're their own particular thing. Whereas blends, with all of their multitude of components, are the full orchestra. So the tools available to artificially craft a balanced experience are all there, and they can be all slotted into place by the master blender to create something that will always be more deliberately balanced than a single malt. There is no chance at work in a blend, and there never will be. Blends are about consistency. They're not about variation. That is their worst fear, is variation. If a primary distillery changed, then you would be very, very afraid as a blender that had to produce the next Johnny Walker 12-year-old or so forth. It would be really quite a nightmare. So we'll hope that doesn't happen for their sake. At any rate, I think this is really quite a good blend. You have to pay quite a lot of money for it, which is the same for really all blends. They are not cheap, despite the slightly more affordable grain whisky that goes into them. So who knows why that is? Maybe it's something to do with the lovely packaging and the Robert Carlyle advertisements on the internet. Who knows? At any rate, if you are willing to pay the price, this is, I think, one of the better blends out there, and even one of the better 18-year-old blends out there. I think that stands above a few of the other competitors around there. But, man, feel free to share your thoughts if you have a particular favourite. Like I said, we're mostly single malt people around here. I'm really not too up with the blend scene. That's probably about 10% of what I drink at best. But to give it a score, and actually it will be our first blend score, so we've got a bunch of first scores going up this week, so somewhat meaningless on its own. As a blend, I'm going to score this a 76. There's certainly room for improvement, and I have tasted better, but for something as manifestly commonly available as this, that's not so bad. And you can rely on that this year, next year, last year, or 10 years from now, it will always be that good. Unless there's some sort of horrible disaster, in which case that'll be sort of exciting in its own right. But at any rate, if I go too long here, over this mere blended whisky. Thank you for tuning in. This has been the Single Malt Review Casual Drams. If you've got a casual dram that you think I should take a look at, then do let me know, because I really do need advice there. We're very technical whisky people over here. We like very technical, very out there whiskies. We're a bit ignorant when it comes to blends, so we could use a bit of advice. At any rate, Sludger, keep safe, and we have some very exciting things for you coming up in the next week or so, and they're not all from Scotland, so I'll keep you guessing there. In the meantime, catch you around.